Then in 1897, Freud famously rejected the seduction hypothesis. The seduction hypothesis was that people were being naughty. People were having sex with people that weren't supposed to, not their wives, their maids. People were abusing other people. People were doing stuff with children, physical and sex, all that stuff. And Freud basically said, that's all made up. I don't want to deal with that. And Jim thinks it's in part because his clientele was the very peak of Vienna society. And nobody wanted to talk about this or admit this. So Freud said, I'm going to explain away the actuality of any of that having happened. We'll say none of that really happened. There was none of this naughtiness and this untoward Me Too behavior that would get you canceled in a nanosecond. Now, none of it was real, but I have this great theory with id, ego, and superego that explains why everybody thinks all this stuff is true. And in doing this, he got rid of hypnosis, he got rid of dissociation, he got rid of selves. He said it was all wrong and not worth spending any time on. So by around 1910, when Freud had really, his tide was so huge. He had a nephew who was a great publicist. His ideas took the world. He became the preeminent figure in the world on this stuff. And he said it wasn't real and we should ignore it. And none of it is true. And that's really when Selves went underground, only to pop up again with, the Three Faces of Eve and Sybil, other than, like I said, with people like Sri Aurobindo and the Mother and Gurdjieff and then Assagioli. And then later, we had Voice Dialogue and later than that Cam's IFS. And, so there have been people who have kept working with parts and cells all along. But as the whole premise being a reality, 1906 Harvard conference of 1897, Freud said no. And by 1910, it was dead. It was, as I like to say it, a meme non grata. It wasn't welcome anywhere. Anybody who brought that up was thought to be crazy or a fool, especially if they said it was true about them. So it went away for 100 years, basically. Until the late 1970s, when the smart progressive therapists began picking it up and began realizing, oh, these people are traumatized. Oh, we can get to the self that was traumatized and help heal it, and that'll make a big difference. So so it's not really 100 years. It's more like 60 years. It was dead, except for the novels, which became more and more sensationalized. And like When Rabbit Howls is the one where the woman has over 100 personalities, but it's really gripping, and you don't want to read the story that gave rise to the title. And then also the very famous, I'll stop now, the very famous book that happened called The Minds of Billy Milligan, where the guy who wrote Flowers for Algernon, Daniel Keyes, wrote this in-depth psychological police and criminal justice narrative about this one guy who had 23 personalities. And it was a scientific event. And you could really see how the cells, admittedly incohesive and some of them crazy, really shifted in and out. It's really a breakthrough work.
So not commenting on the sort of inclusion of the sort of the novels you were talking about and the movement towards these other parts models yet, I just want to sort of reiterate and make sort of a comment on how disturbing it was to learn that the whole premise that Freud has, which is deeply integrated into how the sort of common person understands what their mind is, which is
how we speak.
Exactly.
The very way we speak. Right. You can't get rid of the word ego. It's always there.
Exactly. Yeah. Ego, or like, that's just my ego. There's like this way of thinking, and even the singular self-assumption as it is, although there's some religious associations I'll ask you about afterwards. And that this existed as a way to protect the sort of, his friends, the elite, likely his funders, from being accused and sort of like, what's the word? Sort of, identified and publicly known as being abusers of the people who were his patients, who were these elite people's sort of daughters and stuff. To think about that, such a huge impact on all of how we understand ourselves and our mind and the world being rooted in the cover up of abusing children and sexual abuse is like huge, but also now post Me Too makes perfect sense. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say there are a lot of people who have risen to defend Freud in the last 10 or 20 years, but I don't see how they can explain this away. I think, we think this is what happened. And this is not a history you read anywhere else. we kind of came up with this by looking at the documents and going back and translating things from Paris newspapers using Google and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah.
And
I'm glad you recognize what a watershed it is, that if we're something like correct and that everyone has different cells and can pragmatically at least benefit, and the whole thing got pushed aside in order to protect people, that is kind of crazy, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's it points out to me why like there's a book, I think it's called like we've had 100 years of psychoanalysis and we're only getting worse. Why traditional Freudian psychoanalysis doesn't seem to have even vastly remotely the kind of impact on sort of well-being and trauma healing that some of the more modern parts-oriented models seem to have.
Yeah, that was a book by James Hillman. I saw him give a lecture at that in a local bookstore. Cool. So, and James Hillman, of course, is a Jungian disciple, and he's in our history too because he goes two ways on Selves. But yeah, you're exactly right. You really get it.